Our next speaker is Dr. Emma Shortis. Emma is a historian and writer focused on the history and politics of the US and its role in the world. She's a senior researcher in the International and Security Affairs program at the Australia Institute. Her book, Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the US, takes a critical look at the subservient relationship, and she regularly comments on how we might imagine a different future. The title of her talk is The Cruelty is the Point, Australia and the Politics of Empire. Emma Shortis.
Thank you so much for having me. So, after the death of his beloved predecessor in 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited a volatile and messy conflict in Vietnam. Determined to honour JFK's legacy by continuing his policies, worried that Vietnam would prevent him from creating the great society that he so cared about, and absolutely terrified of failure, Johnson tortured himself over what to do about what he called that damn little pissant country. Transcripts of Johnson's telephone conversations in 1964 show that he had long discussions with his friends about how a war in Vietnam would be a disaster for the United States. He knew. In a telephone conversation with Senator Richard Russell in 1963, Johnson had lamented, "I don't think the people of this country know much about Vietnam, and I think that they care a hell of a lot less." The American people might not have cared, but it mattered to Johnson all the same. Responding to Senator Russell's suggestion that the United States get out of Vietnam, LBJ asked, "Wouldn't that pretty much fix us in the eyes of the world and make us look mighty bad?" Johnson knew what would happen in Vietnam, and by the end, he knew that he was risking his domestic agenda. But he was so worried about the United States looking mighty bad that he did it anyway. Today, even still, it's almost, I think, impossible to process, to really comprehend the scale and the cruelty of that pointless war. The numbers we have probably underestimate the toll, but along with Australia's 521 dead, there were nearly 60,000 Americans, and an estimated 1.62 million Vietnamese civilians, 1.1 million northern and 250,000 southern Vietnamese military casualties. At least 84,000 of those casualties were children. I started with Vietnam because as a historian of the US in the world, I wanted to make a point about what the empire will do, what the leader of the empire will do to avoid looking mighty bad, or when it feels, or they feel, that their dominance is threatened. To the ruler of an empire, even one who is ostensibly progressive and committed to expanding democracy at home, like LBJ was, looking bad is a terrible enough prospect that it is worth causing unspeakable suffering to avoid. And that really is the crux of it, I think. Julian committed the most grievous of crimes against the empire. He made the United States look mighty bad, and he is being made to pay for it. In 2018, at roughly the midpoint of the Trump administration, Adam Serwer wrote a really stunning piece for The Atlantic magazine, from which I take my title. It was called "The Cruelty is the Point." Serwer wrote that Trump's politics and his support is based on a clear principle. Only the president and his allies, his supporters, and their anointed are entitled to the rights and protections of the law, and if necessary, immunity from it. The rest of us are entitled only to cruelty by their whim. Sewa was writing about Trump, of course, but he might have been writing about empire and its treatment of the rest of the world. He might have been writing about empire and its treatment of Julian. Because Julian exposed the crimes of empire, he must be made into an outcast. He must be made subject to the law, but not protected by the law. He must be made a pariah, a person who can be disposed of, but not quite made a sacrifice. It's a state of being where an individual is subject to the total sovereignty of the state, kind of similar to martial law, where rights are suspended in favour of the government. So Julian has become this kind of outcast, subject to US law for publishing materials which indicated unlawful actions by the United States, without any accountability to the citizens who elect the US government that supposedly acts on their behalf. Julian was not a servant of that government. He's not even a citizen. And so he was never required to maintain the confidentiality of its actions. Yet now he becomes the victim of that government's wish to maintain its secrecy and avoid accountability. The empire has created a scapegoat for its own fundamental failures of command and accountability. Julian is being forced to carry the responsibility for everybody implicated in the crimes of empire. The cruelty he is being dealt is precisely the point. Now, all of that flies in the face of the image that the current president has tried to construct around himself. Joe Biden, like LBJ before him, is actually a man of great empathy. In early 2020, as the presidential nominating process was getting underway, and in the twilight of the Trump administration, the Irish writer Fintan O'Toole published an extraordinary piece on Joe Biden in the New York Review of Books. In The Designated Mourner, O'Toole observed that Biden's great appeal was the way in which he understood the collective grief of Americans, and that Biden himself embodied a politics of empathy in which the leader shares the pain of the citizen. O'Toole understood, as he wrote, the power and the sincerity of Biden's empathy. It is real and rooted and fundamentally decent. It has at its core the baffled humility of the human helplessness in the face of death that makes life so difficult to discern. As an antidote to Donald Trump's grotesquely inflated greatness, it has authentic force. So it might seem baffling at first that a man who knows the pain of losing a son would allow Julian's incarceration to continue. But Biden, like Johnson, is not just the President of the United States. He is also the leader of an empire. It is entirely possible for him to be one thing at home and another abroad, one thing to American citizens and another to non-citizens. He is pulled in two very different directions, and he too is deeply sensitive to anything that might make the empire look mighty bad. Anything that might make it look like it isn't, in fact, a force for good in the world, as Ronald Reagan once said. Australia, like Julian, is tied to the Biden who is the head of that empire, not the Biden that O'Toole was writing about. We are tied to the Biden who would drag us into a war with China, not the Biden who feels the pain of American citizens. Just like we were tied to the LBJ who took us to Vietnam, and not the LBJ who built the Great Society. It does not have to be this way. Australia can and should play a role in appealing to what Biden himself has called the better angels of the United States. We must turn away from empire and focus on what is supposed to be the foundational shared value of our relationship, and that is democracy. Biden himself said just yesterday that freedom and democracy are under siege domestically and overseas. But the treatment of Julian under successive administrations, Democrat and Republican, and that has continued under Biden's watch, shows us quite clearly that Biden is not doing enough to protect that freedom and democracy everywhere. And American democracy, if we can even call it that, is in really big trouble. Trump is an active threat to that already fragile democracy. We know he doesn't care about democracy because he has told us. He is actively mused about terminating the US Constitution. And the fact that polling suggests that Biden might not beat an opponent like that is deeply, deeply worrying. Biden is risking American democracy with his attachment to the cruelty of empire, as he blows up his own reputation as a man of empathy in his lack of response, or really in his active complicity to the genocide in Gaza. He's turning young voters away. And given who his opponent is this year, that creates a very big risk for American democracy. And that matters to all of us, and it matters especially to Australia. Australia's alliance with the United States has always been about Australian government's desperate need for proximity to power. It is that proximity to power, and not, as our Defence Minister Richard Marles said in 2022, the shared values that we have as two democracies, that is fundamental to the alliance. In his lonely challenge to American power, Julian loudly revealed that fundamental hypocrisy. He dared to challenge American power by exposing its willingness to breach its own apparently fundamental values, something admirers of that power can't really fathom doing. So it's entirely unsurprising that successive Australian governments would only reluctantly, if at all, support an Australian citizen subject to the exercise of that unaccountable power. But because of the campaign for Julian, that is changing, and it's changing pretty fast. And that's because on questions of justice for Julian and the integrity of our own democratic systems, the people of Australia are actually really clear. Recent polling suggests that as many as 9 in 10 Australians believe that it has been long enough and Julian should be free. In May 2023, polling by the Australia Institute found that 1 in 3 Australians think that the federal government is doing too little to secure Julian's release. And similarly, 3 in 4 people said that whistleblowers make Australia a better place. And an overwhelming majority of Australians, 84% of those surveyed, supported stronger legal protection for whistleblowers. So Australians understand that the revelation of crimes committed by states should not in itself be a crime. We believe in accountability and transparency, and we believe that Julian should be allowed to come home. That is being reflected more and more by our elected representatives, who, as you all know, have supported Julian through bipartisan delegations to Washington and by passing a resolution in Parliament just recently, supported by the Prime Minister. These expressions of the democratic will of the Australian people, taken directly to the democratic representatives of the American people, are doing the critical and desperately needed work of reframing the alliance away from complicity with empire, what Clinton Fernandez has called our sub-imperialism, to a relationship based on democratic solidarity and accountability. They represent one of the first cracks in the previously impenetrable wall of bipartisan support for empire, the first cracks that we have seen in quite literally decades. Together, we can continue to widen those cracks. We can look to our existing shared history of democratic solidarity between the peoples of the United States and the peoples of Australia, a solidarity that has built international coalitions to oppose apartheid, labour exploitation, racist policing, and environmental destruction. We can look to the bonds that exist between two imperfect democracies, and not the bonds between an empire and its deputy sheriff. Such a relationship would understand democracy as both shared interest and shared value, and as foundational to a sustainable and peaceful future. Building that relationship requires that Julian is free. Last year, Joe Biden said that we're facing an inflection point in history, one of those moments where the decisions we make today are going to determine the future for decades to come. And he's right about that. We are at an inflection point for Julian, for empire, and for the alliance. And I think that means we have an opportunity to put it to Biden very clearly. We can and should say that the alliance is contingent on democratic solidarity, on justice, on the universal application of the rule of law. We do not want a relationship or a world marked by cruelty. The Australian government must convince Biden of this on our behalf. They must demand that Julian be allowed to come home. They must seek out the President of the United States, a man who lost his own son and understands the pain of a father, not the leader of an empire desperately afraid of being made to look bad. We want a relationship based on powerful and sincere empathy, empathy that is real and rooted and fundamentally decent. Julian, all of us deserve democracy, we deserve freedom, not cruelty. Thank you.
Thank you to Emma for contrasting so effectively the enormous difference between the way the US likes to project itself as a force for good and what it's actually doing.